A problem gets raised in a meeting. Everyone in the room notices it, and somehow nobody says a word. That silence isn't politeness, and it isn't agreement either. It has a name, and understanding it changes how you should run every meeting you're in charge of. Psychologists have been studying this exact pattern since the late 1960s, and they gave it a name: the bystander effect. The core finding is almost the opposite of what most people assume. You'd think more witnesses to a problem would mean more chances someone steps in. The data says the reverse. The more people who witness something going wrong, the less likely any single person is to act on it. Researchers Bibb, Latane, and Darley tested this directly, not with surveys or hypotheticals, but by staging real emergencies in front of people and secretly timing how they reacted. In one well-known version of their work, a participant would be filling out a questionnaire alone in a room when smoke began drifting in from under a door. Left alone, most people got up, checked it out, and reported it, usually within moments. But when the same scenario played out with several other people in the room, people who, unknown to the real participant, had been instructed to stay calm and do nothing, the response changed dramatically. Individuals sat there far longer, glancing at the others, waiting, doing nothing, even as the room visibly filled with smoke. In another version of their research, someone appeared to be having a medical emergency over an intercom. When a bystander believed they were the only person who could hear it, they intervened quickly most of the time. When they believed several other people could also hear the same emergency, intervention dropped sharply, sometimes by more than half. The mechanism behind this isn't fear, and it isn't callousness. It's something more subtle and, frankly, more universal. Diffusion of responsibility. When you're the only witness to a problem, all of the responsibility for doing something about it sits squarely on you. There's no one else it could belong to. But the moment 9 other people are watching the same thing happen, that single unit of responsibility doesn't vanish. It splits. It gets divided, unconsciously, among everyone present. And in that division, each person quietly assumes someone else, someone more senior, more informed, more directly responsible, will be the one to act. Everyone is waiting for someone else to go first. Nobody goes first. Now take that mechanism and drop it directly into a conference room or a video call with a dozen participants and their cameras off. A plan gets presented. It has a flaw. Not a subtle one. The kind of flaw that, if you asked any 3 people afterward privately, they'd all say they noticed. And yet, in the room, in the moment, nobody raises it. Everyone assumes someone more senior is already tracking it, or that if it were really a serious problem, someone with more context would have already flagged it, or that the person presenting must have already considered this and rejected it for reasons no one else is aware of. The responsibility to speak up has been quietly split 10 or 12 ways, and each person's individual share of it feels small enough to safely ignore. Here's a scenario that plays out in some version in almost every organization. Imagine a team reviewing a project timeline that everyone privately suspects is unrealistic. The project lead presents it with total confidence. A few people in the room have direct hands-on experience suggesting the estimate is off by weeks, maybe longer. Nobody says a word in the meeting itself. Afterward, in the hallway or in a side chat, 2 or 3 of them compare notes and discover they'd all noticed the exact same problem and all separately assumed someone else would raise it first. Nothing about that meeting was unusual or dysfunctional in any special way. It's simply the default outcome of putting a group of reasonably conscientious, reasonably non-confrontational adults in a room together and hoping the truth surfaces on its own. Or imagine a cross-functional review where a new policy is being rolled out, and someone from a department that will be directly affected can see an obvious operational problem with it, a scheduling conflict, a compliance gap, a customer-facing detail nobody upstream has thought through. They notice it clearly. They also notice that nobody senior in the room seems concerned, and they read that calm as a signal that maybe they're overreacting, or maybe it's already been handled somewhere outside this meeting, so they stay quiet. The policy ships with the flaw fully intact, and it resurfaces 3 weeks later as an urgent fire drill that could have been a 2-minute comment in the original meeting where it was first visible to at least one person. Or picture a large all-hands-style review where engineers are walking leadership through a launch plan. and one engineer near the back can see a load testing gap that nobody has mentioned. In a room of 4 people, that same engineer would almost certainly flag it, because there's nobody else it could fall to. In a room of 30, with 3 more senior engineers nodding along, the responsibility to raise it quietly diffuses across the whole room, and the assumption forms instantly and unconsciously. Someone more senior than me has surely already checked this. But here's the part nobody expects when they first hear about the bystander effect. It isn't actually a standalone quirk of human psychology sitting off on its own. It sits inside a small cluster of closely related effects that reinforce each other, and understanding how they interact is what actually helps a manager counter them. The first is pluralistic ignorance, the phenomenon where everyone in a group privately doubts something, but each person assumes they're the only one who doubts it, because everyone else in the room looks calm and confident. In a meeting, pluralistic ignorance and the bystander effect feed each other directly. Not only does each person feel less individually responsible for objecting, each person also misreads the group's collective silence as collective agreement, when in fact the silence is just everyone else quietly running the exact same internal calculation at the exact same time. The second related effect is authority bias, and in a workplace setting it makes the bystander effect considerably worse than it is in a room full of strangers. In Latane and Darley's original experiments, nobody in the room outranked anyone else. In a real meeting, there is almost always a senior person present, a manager, a director, a founder, and their apparent calm carries outsized weight. If the most senior person in the room looks unbothered, everyone else reads that as strong evidence there's nothing worth being bothered about, even when their own direct expertise says otherwise. That's authority bias, compounding diffusion of responsibility. Not only does everyone assume someone else will speak up, they specifically assume the senior person would have already spoken up if it truly mattered, so that silence gets read as a verdict rather than as the same hesitation everyone else in the room is quietly feeling. There's also a milder, related pattern worth naming here: social loafing, the well-documented tendency for individual effort to drop as group size grows, observed across everything from physical tasks to open brainstorming sessions. Social loafing is about effort broadly, while the bystander effect is specifically about acting on a noticed problem, but they share the same underlying arithmetic. The same total amount of responsibility or effort, divided across more people, produces less from each individual, even though nobody involved would ever describe themselves as lazy or indifferent. It's a structural effect, not a character flaw, and that distinction matters enormously for how a manager should actually respond to it. Because here's the practical implication, and it's a far more useful one than simply telling your team to speak up more. Telling people to be braver doesn't fix a structural problem. If the dynamic is essentially mathematical, responsibility literally divides by the number of people in the room, then the fix has to change the math, not the mood. The single most reliable lever available to a manager is meeting size. Every person added to a discussion measurably dilutes each individual's felt responsibility to flag a problem. A 5-person review of a risky decision will surface objections that a 15-person version of the exact same review will not because the 15-person group is less capable, but because responsibility divided by 15 is simply a much smaller number than responsibility divided by 5. If a decision genuinely needs input from 15 people, that is itself a signal to split it into smaller sequential conversations, rather than one large room. The second lever is replacing open invitations with direct, individual questions. Does anyone have any objections is, structurally, close to the worst possible way to surface a concern, because it hands every single person in the room quiet permission to assume someone else will answer it. Asking a specific person by name, "What's your read on the timeline risk here?" removes the diffusion entirely. There's no one else the question could be directed at. The responsibility to answer sits with exactly one named person, the way it did with Latane and Darley's solo participants, who intervened quickly and reliably when nobody else was around to defer to. The third lever, and one of the more counterintuitive ones, is deliberately assigning a single person the explicit job of challenging the plan before the meeting even starts, a designated dissenter, sometimes called a devil's advocate role, whose job for that meeting is specifically to find and voice the flaw out loud. This works because it preempts the diffusion mechanism entirely. Nobody in that seat can assume someone else will do it, because doing it is explicitly, structurally, their assigned job, on the record, in advance of the discussion. A fourth lever, particularly useful for anything with real financial or operational stakes attached, is separating hearing a concern from voicing it publicly in the room. A private message to the meeting lead beforehand, a short written comment submitted ahead of the discussion, an anonymous flag left in a shared planning document. These routes let people surface genuine objections without needing to be the one person in a group of 12 who speaks first, and possibly alone. Once one objection is already on the table, in writing, the diffusion dynamic for everyone else in the room changes completely, because the responsibility to be first has already been discharged by someone else. A fifth, smaller lever worth building into a habit, rotating who opens the discussion on a given topic, rather than always defaulting to the most senior voice in the room speaking first. Once a senior person has spoken and signaled a direction, everyone else's independent judgment gets pulled toward agreeing with it, on top of the diffusion already happening. Asking a junior or less senior voice to react first, before the room anchors on a senior opinion, surfaces real disagreement earlier and more often. It's also worth naming how this differs from groupthink, a related idea most managers have already heard of. Groupthink describes a group actively converging on a shared, overly confident conclusion. Because dissent feels socially costly, people bite their tongue because disagreeing feels risky to group harmony. The bystander effect is quieter and, in a way, more concerning, because no active pressure toward harmony is even required. Nobody has to feel afraid of disagreeing. The silence happens purely from the arithmetic of divided responsibility, even in a room where dissent would be perfectly welcome if anyone offered it. That's part of why the fix looks different too. You can't talk a team out of a math problem by telling them dissent is safe. The responsibility has to be explicitly reassigned to specific people, not just declared open for anyone who feels brave enough to grab it. One more scenario worth having in mind, because so much work now happens this way: a hybrid meeting where half the room is in person and half is on a video call, cameras off, muted by default. This setting compounds the bystander effect further, because the remote participants can't read the room's body language the way in-person participants can. And in-person participants often forget the remote participants are even following closely enough to notice a flaw. Each remote participant assumes someone in the physical room, who presumably has more context from side conversations, will raise anything that matters. Each in-person participant assumes the remote participants, being less engaged by default, probably didn't catch the issue anyway. Both assumptions can be wrong at once, and the flaw survives the meeting because neither group feels like the responsible one. The part I find most counterintuitive about this whole pattern, having watched it play out across plenty of ordinary meetings, is that the people who stay silent are almost never the least engaged or least capable people in the room. Often, it's the opposite. Conscientious, competent people are precisely the ones most likely to assume that someone more senior or more informed has already accounted for the problem they're noticing, because assuming competence in others is itself a reasonable, decent instinct. The bystander effect doesn't punish carelessness. It quietly taxes exactly the people you'd most want to hear from. There's a sixth practical lever worth adding to a manager's toolkit, and it works after the fact rather than during the meeting itself. A short, blame-free debrief once something does go wrong, asking specifically whether anyone noticed the problem beforehand and didn't say anything, and if so, why. Run that debrief enough times, honestly and without punishing the people who admit they saw it coming. And the answer converges on the same structural explanation almost every time. Someone assumed somebody else would raise it. Once a team has heard that answer out loud a few times, in their own voices, the abstract concept of diffused responsibility stops being a psychology lecture and starts being something the team recognizes happening to them in real time, which makes every other lever on this list land with far more weight the next time it's used. Here's the piece worth sitting with, and it's the one thing about this that gets missed even by managers who've already heard of the bystander effect before. Silence in a meeting is not information. It feels like information. It feels like confirmation that the plan is fine, that nobody sees a problem, that it's safe to move forward. But, structurally, Silence from a group of 12 tells you almost nothing about whether a real problem exists, and quite a lot about how large the group in the room happened to be. Reading silence as agreement is exactly backwards, and it is the single easiest way for a genuinely flawed plan to sail cleanly through a room full of people who privately knew better the entire time. So the actual management takeaway here isn't the vague version, build a culture where people feel safe speaking up, true as that is in the abstract. It's more specific and far more immediately usable than that. Before your next meeting, where a real decision is on the line, decide in advance exactly who you're going to ask directly by name. Decide honestly whether the room actually needs to be as large as it currently is, and consider naming one person, out loud, whose job that day is specifically to go find the hole in the plan. Do that consistently, meeting after meeting, and you stop hoping responsibility surfaces on its own and start deliberately designing meetings where it structurally cannot quietly disappear into the crowd. If this kind of thing is useful to you, follow for the psychology behind how teams actually work.